as the Reconstruction era and the end of the Civil War bring us through the 1870s into the 1880s and into the 1890s, there are increasing problems among the two portions of the country. The industrialized North and the agricultural South are going to continue to butt heads and have differing interests. One of the things that has been a persistent issue throughout this course has been the problem between the urban and the North versus the rural and the South. And that has played out in the Hamilton and Jefferson debates, that has played out in the spread of slavery in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, that has played out in the American Civil War, that has played out in the ideals of Reconstruction. These are going to be persistent issues that are going to keep coming back to our issues here in American history. And it's something that we still see today. But as the 1890s come around and the end of our period here is upon us, there are going to be growing divides, right? By the time we get to the 1890s, we are in the second part of the Industrial Revolution, right? We are no longer in that first wave of industrialization where those first couple of businesses are being formed and those first industries are moving. Now we have great urbanization happening. The social problems of that urbanization, the filth and the disgusting nature of the cities, is going to be a persistent issue. And all of that is going to be in the context of these struggles, these problems that are going to plague the United States. So the farmers in the United States have massive problems as we get towards the 1890s. There's going to be movement out to the west. There's going to be movement into different rural areas. And there's going to be massive surplus on these products, right? As different countries are expanding their own power, and as global trade is emerging and continuing, one of the things that's going to happen is that American food prices are going to be too high for people to purchase. And there's going to need to be a change in the monetary policy. There's the gold standard, that is the standard by which all American money is based, and when we are tied to that gold standard, right, basically means that it's the price is tied to the value of gold. You know, places with cheaper prices and cheaper labor can ultimately provide food at a lower rate. This also is going to lead to, there's an elite versus poor or middle class. This is going to lead to an urban versus rural situation where for the urban folks, right, their wages are a bit more stable and a bit more steady, whereas the people in the middle of the country and the rural areas that are farmers will not have that potential. So there's going to be a quest, at least among populists, who are going to look to try and regulate businesses and regulate farm prices. So that they're going to look for government ownership over certain industries. They're going to look for co-ops to sell their food to markets a little bit cheaper. But there's also a way to try and reduce the potential of the gold standard. One of the other things that's going to be a predominant issue here is the issues of African Americans and the experiences that they are going to have. One of the things that is definitely plaguing African American folks and people of color throughout this portion of American history is that they have, slavery ended in 1865, but the people who were released from slavery were not, in many cases, were not literate. They did not own land. They did not have the funds to even begin to purchase that land. So what happens is you have a situation where there's sharecropping and tenant farming that's going to bind people to land. There's also going to be massive racism, obviously, throughout the United States. In the United States history, that has been one of our persistent plaguing issues up until today in the 21st century. However, there are conflicting ideas of how African Americans should aim for their rights. For some, like Booker T. Washington, who founds the Tuskegee Institute in the South, and he wants to focus on vocational schools and technical training, get good jobs to sort of inch people's ways into the middle class, and then from that position, develop stronger footholds to ultimately purchase land and get into better positions within the United States. The protection of economic and property rights was really the primary goal of his desires. For other people, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born after slavery to two slave parents, his belief was it's really more classical education. Get into schools, get into colleges, and develop real knowledge to hopefully, get your positions, get positions through merit. He is the first Harvard PhD for an African American man. He founds the NAACP. So the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People that provides scholarships and other forms of assistance for African Americans to get their education. Again, go to college and get into the middle class through merit. One of the other things, and I don't have a slide on this here, but one of the other things that the African American population is experiencing is something called the Great Migration. This is where youngish people from the South, youngish African American and other and Latinos and Latinx and other groups of people are moving from the South to the North, from rural southern villages and towns up to urban environments in the North. So places like Chicago, places like Harlem, places like, I should say the south side of Chicago and Harlem, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Cleveland, Cincinnati. And they're looking for jobs in those places because those are booming urban and industrial environments, and they're moving there. But the other piece to this is that there's going to be massive cultural changes with that, right? So the growth of the Harlem Renaissance, and again, Harlem Renaissance obviously does take place in Harlem, but there's also this idea that it's sort of like Wall Street, right? Where Wall Street really just means the financial industry. Harlem Renaissance can mean sort of just any African American literature from, let's say, 1910 to 1935 or something like that. One of the other things that becomes important in this sort of late 19th century period is imperialism. The United States, although we don't typically think of the United States as an imperial nation, one of the things the United States does is begin to imperialize. The United States, because of things such as racism and white man's burden, as well as competition between other nations, are going to look for places to put their flag. And they're going, by the end of the 19th century, the United States controls from, Long Island to California. The United States has taken control over Hawaii. And that desire to conquer sea to sea, coast to coast, and has been a driving factor in American history. And as we get to the early 1900s, one of the things that is going to be persistent is there's no more land to conquer, so we must look outward. And that's where we look at places like Cuba, and we have the Spanish-American War, and other instances of these items of imperialism. So that by 1910, the United States is not just the 48 contiguous states plus territories in Alaska and Hawaii, but it then turns into a very strong hold in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, the Micronesian Islands. So what happens here is America is expanding their territory and their footprint. As we conclude this semester, it's important for us to remember that one of the guiding principles here in the American story have been this sort of redefinition of what freedom means. There has been this consistent struggle between the urban and the rural, the agrarian and the industrial. And those items are not going to go away. Today in the 21st century, we are frequently discussing, what does freedom mean? Freedom for who? Freedom in what way? And these same questions are ones that have plagued the generations that are before us. But hopefully through wise decisions and good counsel, we can prevent those types of contests and struggles that have plagued the United States in the past. It's been a pleasure. Take care, and all the best.